Good morning, everyone. Well, we're going to continue with Chapter 10, the Cold War. Today we're going to do Part 4, the Korean War. The Korean War is also referred to as the Forgotten War because so many people in America never really paid attention. After World War II, the Greatest Generation, when everyone was all involved, then we fight in Korea and no one even knows it's going on. So many of the veterans like to refer to it as the Forgotten War, like they were forgotten. Now, the Korean War starts in 1950 and ends in 1953. Way back in 1910, Korea was taken over by Japan. It was its first conquest before World War II and had been ruled by Japan until the end of World War II when the Soviets invaded. Now, so after World War II, the Soviets were in Korea. They wanted to take control of it. We said no. So there was a agreement to divide it into two zones of occupation. We see here on the map that North Korea in pink here, and then you see South Korea in green. Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea, and Seoul, of course, is the capital of South Korea. And it's divided along the 38th parallel. All right, so it's very even right across the parallel. Now, since the U.S. is in the south and the Soviet Union is in the north, we're going to see a very pro-U.S. government develop in the south. It was led by a man by the name of Syngman Rhee. He was a real anti-communist authoritarian dictator. Communist North Korea was led by a man by the name of Kim Il-sung. He's actually the great-grandfather of the current leader, Kim Jong-un. In fact, the Kim family had been ruling Korea since the end of World War II. They just pass it down from father to son. And there's Kim Il-sung back again. Now, in June of 1950, North Korea troops invade South Korea. Their goal is to unite, or I should say reunite Korea under communism. Now, the North Korean military forces have Soviet tanks, they have Soviet jet planes, other Soviet equipment, and it's a real strong military. South Korea really doesn't have very much. So it becomes no contest. The North Koreans push deep into South Korea. They capture the city of Seoul very quickly. The South Korean army is falling apart. There's desertions and so on, and it's just because it's a disaster. They get actually pushed to the very southern tip of the Korean peninsula, around the city of Busan. I have a little map here to show you. You see here, we have North Korea in red and South Korea in blue. Across the water from South Korea, you see there's Japan. And just make note of the northern border of North Korea. Yes, that's the People's Republic of China. That's Communist China. Communist North Korea. You see where this is going, right? Okay. Here we see the initial invasion into North Korea, capturing Seoul, pushing all the way down, and you can see where the South Koreans are left just on that one corner of the country down near Busan. It's just a matter of time before the South Koreans are wiped out and the North Koreans win. Not so fast. The UN Security Council votes to help South Korea with military support. Now, this is would never happen because the five-man Security Council, as we've already covered, has veto power. Any one nation of those five of the Security Councils, including the Soviet Union, can veto this. Now, obviously, the Soviet Union would never allow the United Nations to send forces to fight against the North Koreans who they are supplying. However, the Soviet Unions were not there. The Soviet Union is very upset that China is one of the five members of the Security Council, as we mentioned. But there are now two Chinas. There is the Communist China, which covers pretty much everything, and then there's little nationalist China in Taiwan. But nationalist China was the original founding member, not the communist. So they are still considered the members, as opposed to the gigantic second largest population in the world country of China. So the Soviets are very upset with that, so they decide to boycott the United Nations over the China issue. They really picked a bad time to boycott. The vote comes up, they're not there, they're back in the Soviet Union because they're boycotting. So they're not there to veto the move. So the United Nations Security Council passes, and now the United Nations is going to send military forces to Korea. Now, the UN military forces will be made up of 16 UN countries. Naturally, the United States will have the largest. We send the most soldiers. We'll eventually send 325,000 soldiers, sailors, Marines to Korea. And among them is Mrs. McGady's father, right, sweetheart?
Yes.
Yes.
The forgotten war vet. I've heard it all grown up.
Anyway, other countries, Britain sent 14,000, Canada sent 8,000, Turkey 5,400 soldiers, Australia 2,300, the Philippines sent 1,500 soldiers, New Zealand 1,400 soldiers, Greece 1,300, France 1,100, Colombia in South America sent 1,000 soldiers, Belgium sent 900, and even little Luxembourg, which is a very small little nation, one of the 3 low countries, sent 44 men. Now, you might laugh at that, so 44 men, but that was actually 1/10 of their military. In fact, 1/3 of them actually became casualties in the war. So percentage-wise, they suffered the most, percentage-wise. Now, since it's mostly an American force, we're going to send our commander, an American commander, to command the UN forces. Harry Truman, President Truman, will pick General Douglas MacArthur to lead the UN forces. This is the same Douglas MacArthur that gave the famous, let me just get some, mouth gets dry, who led the, the famous, in the Philippines in World War II, I Shall Return, who returned back in 1944, coming ashore. Well, after the war is over, he actually has become the military governor of Japan, where he's going to because after we defeated Japan, we're going to run things until they can get a government, a democracy government installed. So MacArthur stays there for a number of years. And so naturally, when the UN needs a commander, Truman picks him. I'll give you a spoiler alert. Truman is going to regret that. Now, when the UN forces get to Pusan, MacArthur realizes that it's a really bad situation. They're trapped with their backs to the sea. So he pulls off an incredible military maneuver. He sends troops outside of Pusan, around the Korean Peninsula, onto the west coast of South Korea, at Incheon. So on September 15th, UN forces landed in Incheon, which is near Seoul in the 38th parallel, further north than Pusan. All right, let's show you here on the map. Now you see the blue area, that's where the South Koreans are, and now, of course, the UN forces are there. We see the UN flag. So MacArthur's plan is to move them up and around the peninsula and land here at Incheon. This catches the North Koreans totally by surprise, and they have to start pulling back. Some pictures here. These are showing the American Marines. They had to use ladders to climb up the seawall. We see some Soviet tanks that were given to or sold to the North Koreans. Well, maybe they were given to them. Destroyed by the UN forces. And of course, here's Douglas MacArthur coming ashore. He likes these photo ops. There's one thing they used to say about Douglas MacArthur. He never met a camera he didn't like or a microphone he wasn't willing to talk to. Waiting for the chimes to stop. They're done. Now, the landings are one of the most decisive military operations in modern history. The North Koreans are caught totally by surprise. Their supply lines are cut off. They have to start pulling back to the north. UN forces recapture Seoul within just 10 days of the landing. Brutal house-to-house fighting here. Here we see some South Korean and UN soldiers fighting with the North Koreans. Here are some North Korean prisoners captured by the South Koreans. The South Koreans weren't members of the United Nations, but we were fighting with them. Now the North Koreans pull back across the 38th parallel, and to the surprise of no one, MacArthur follows them. His plan is to defeat the North Koreans and take over North Korea. He wants to do the exact opposite, unite it, but under a democracy. So again, here we see the map, and we see the UN forces pushing the North Koreans back to their northern border. And of course, their northern border, of course, is with, that's right, China. Who's very nervous watching? China. MacArthur decides he wants to have this new home by Christmas offensive. He wants to end the war by Christmas. All right, so we have like 2 months to get to win the war. So the UN forces are pushing forward, and they start approaching the North Koreans' border with China. And that's it. The China has been watching them, and they're ready to do something. You kind of know where this is going, right? Okay. Now, since China is very concerned with the UN forces close to their border, they decide, they felt that the UN forces might invade China. They're only separated by the Yalu River. So they aren't going to wait. So right before Thanksgiving, Chinese troops crossed the border into North Korea. And they're going to now help the North Koreans fight the UN forces. The war is now totally different. All right, again, it was just the small North Koreans, but now we have this massive military of the Chinese are now fighting on their side. So the war is totally different. Now, within a couple days, 120,000 Chinese troops trap about 30,000 UN forces, US, British, and South Korean soldiers. Most of the forces are the Marines from the 1st Marine Division, and they're trapped around the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea. The UN troops, later nicknamed the Chosin Few, fought off the Chinese for 17 days in freezing weather. You might actually see the Chosin Few. We have a street here in Bayonne named after them. So if you ever see anything called the Chosin, spelled Chosin, you know it's in a reference to the battle in Northern Korea. Now here we see some of the soldiers fighting on the hillside. Even looking at the pictures, it looks cold. Very cold. These men are trying to warm their meal up. But they held out against the North Koreans and the Chinese. Finally, on December 6th, the UN forces break out and escape south. They had unfortunately lost over 1,000 killed. This is one of the, I found this kind of funny. When asked if they were retreating, the Marine General, Oliver Smith, he was the commander of the 1st Marine, famously said, "Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction." Gotta love that line. Now, the Chinese will lose over 60,000 soldiers. Against the Marines, they used to have these bugle charges. They hear the bugles, and they would charge up the hills, and the Marines would be in a desperate fight and just keep shooting at them, and they kept coming and coming. Very similar to the Banzai charges the Marines saw in the Pacific Islands during World War II. They weren't very successful, these charges, and as you can see, it cost the Chinese 40% of their forces in Korea. And this will hurt their ability to continue their offense into South Korea. Now, since the Chinese and North Koreans pushed the UN forces back into South Korea, see here on the map, the Chinese now are involved crossing the border, and the Americans and South Koreans have to pull back. But they really, after these losses at Chosin Reservoir, they can't really push any further. And since the Chinese forces are still fairly considerable, we can't really go back at them. So both sides settle into what we call a stalemate. All right, we really can't push them. They can't really push us. MacArthur's not happy with a stalemate. He wants to break it by expanding the war into China. He even suggests using nuclear weapons against the Chinese. Now, Truman doesn't want the war to escalate, especially with nuclear weapons. You know, we could have World War III and Russia could get involved. It right now, as you know, it's exploded its first atomic bomb, so it's developing weapons. So Truman doesn't want to do this. He tells MacArthur no. MacArthur doesn't take no for an answer too well. So he starts going behind Truman's back and writing letters to Congress, trying to get congressmen to get the people, you know, in their districts to support them and to support MacArthur's plan to kind of force Truman to go along with it. Truman finds out about it and is not very happy. So the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of the military, so he sees this as insubordination. And he really is left with no choice, though he knows he's going to make a lot of people angry, but he fires MacArthur, basically for insubordination. This becomes huge in America. There are so many people that are big supporters of MacArthur. They see him as being a legend, and you know, I don't know why, but they do. So it causes a lot of controversy. But MacArthur's a good general. Matthew Ridgway, who fought with the U.S. Army in France, D-Day, through Germany. He was an exceptional general, and he will now become the new commander of the UN forces in Korea. Now, the war, I want to mention this, the war sees new uses of technology. Remember we talked about World War I, a lot of new technology. Well, the Korean War also sees technology. Now, one of them are jet fighters. Now, we had talked about the Germans using jet fighters in World War II, but now that technology has expanded, the Russians and the Americans and the British all captured those Messerschmitt 262s, took them apart, and they were able to expand and create our own jet fighters, but so could the Russians. The Americans had this F-86 Sabre. This was by far a superior jet. It was our first real true jet fighter, and it saw a lot of action in the Korean War. The Soviets, on the other hand, had created the MiG-15. Soviets always call their planes afterwards, everything was a MiG. It's an initial or something for something the Soviets use. This photograph here of the MiG M15 is actually in Washington, D.C. I took this about 2 summers ago. We were down at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum out at Dulles Airport, the big one. So I have a picture of the MiG-15. The Soviets gave them to the Chinese, sold them to the Chinese and to the North Koreans. So both the Chinese actually had these MiG-15. So we saw a lot of dogfights in the air between the MiG-15s and the F-86 Sabres. Another technology were helicopters. They were working on helicopters toward the end of World War II, but they never actually saw any action in World War II. But in the Korean War, the United States will use the helicopter. We'll move troops around with it. And another thing we'll do is we use them to transport wounded soldiers. The United States developed the concept of the MASH, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. And we have these small little Huey Bell helicopters. And you can, they actually had the stretchers on the outside of the helicopter. You can see them there. Let's see if I can point one of them out here. All right, can you see them there? These are stretchers on the outside, and they would put 2 wounded soldiers. Then they would fly the men to one of these mobile units where they would have surgical units in tents very close to the front lines. Some of these men would not make it back to hospitals in Seoul and further back. So they had these MASH units up front where they can move them fast. If the enemy's coming, they can move them back, they can move them forward. And the doctors and the surgeons could work right there, and the nurses could work right there on the soldiers. This became the subject of a very famous movie, and then later a TV show called MASH. This was one of my favorite TV shows. I used to love watching this back in the, when was it, 1980s?
What?
MASH?
Yes.
Yeah, back in the 1980s. I ran for like 12 years or so.
Well, it ran longer than the war.
Ran much longer than the actual war ran. But it was all about the Korean War. And if you ever see an episode of MASH or know anything about it, it's all about the Korean War. Now, the war is going to drag on for 2 more years while both sides discuss an armistice. During this time, U.S. bombers hit the North Korean cities, including the capital like Pyongyang, and they just devastate. These are these high-level bombers. The jets cannot reach them up that high, so there's no way they can get up there. So they are just bombing with impunity. They destroy 75% of the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. In fact, it was so devastating, they actually had to cancel further missions because there was nothing left of importance to bomb. Another thing is North Korea had no real navy, just some patrol boats. So, of course, we have our strong navy that had defeated the Japanese. So we had our big battleships, our brand new battleships, just go offshore and fire their big guns against targets inland. Here we see the USS New Jersey. All right, one of our newest battleships firing on land targets in Korea. Those guns could fire shells a couple miles, so they could actually hit targets on shore. Now, July 27th, 1953, after 2 years of negotiations, both sides agreed to an armistice. Now, this is a ceasefire, all right? Like we saw on November 11th, the 11th hour, the 11th day, 11th month in 1918, World War I, there was a ceasefire. And then it was followed up by a treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, but it was followed up by a treaty that officially ended the war. Well, the Korean War never followed up with a treaty. There has never been a treaty. So technically, the war is still on, except there's a ceasefire. And this ceasefire has now been going on for, 67 years. Now, in the very beginning, they decided to create the border between the North and the South, and they created what they called a DMZ. That stands for Demilitarized Zone. This goes across the 39th parallel, which divides North Korea and South Korea. And it's still in effect today, though it's gotten a little more modern than the strings of barbed wire you see here. We now have these blue buildings that have been built, and they're right on the border between North Korea and South Korea. All right, let's see. I'm going to try to see if I can draw this border here. I'm not really great with. There we go. Hey, that's pretty good. Nice and good. That's the border between North Korea and South Korea. These gentlemen back here are North Korean soldiers. You can see they're I think one of them has got a camera in his hand. While these men here and over here are American or UN soldiers, and their job is to stay on the other side, and we really kind of have a staring contest between the two. Now, the building up here, I'm going to go back to red. This building here, as I'm trying to do this neatly, that's the North Korean headquarters building, all right? And that's where because that's on the North Korean side. All right, I'm going to erase all these lines. 1, 2, and here. Now here we see an aerial view. Oh, forgot one more line. There we go. And we see the border here. All right, let's see if I can get the border in here. There it is. That's the border between the two. And this building here is the UN, United States headquarters along the border. It's where our men, are stationed. These blue buildings here, and here are they're actually on the border, half in North Korea, half in South Korea. So if there's any negotiations, anything that goes on, it goes on in these buildings. All right, let me see if I can just erase these lines here. All right, now, moving on. Here we see, this was a real historical event. It occurred last summer, June 2019. President Donald Trump became the first U.S. president to visit North Korea. Here we see him pictured with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. Currently, President Trump is still the president of the United States, but we don't know what's going on with Kim Jong-un at the moment. There's been a lot of reports. Some people have said he's dead. We don't know where he is. He hasn't been seen or heard from in a while. His sister's been doing a lot of stuff there. So apparently the rumor is there's some sort of operation and things went bad. He could be in a coma. He could be dead. We don't know. But anyway, this was actually a very historical moment. No president has ever been to North Korea. See here. Now, in the war, neither side gained any territory. All right. This is called the status quo. We're in the south. The North Koreans are in the north. Neither side gets anything. The war, though you might say, well, nothing really happened. The war, we went right back to the beginning, except for the fact that 36,516 U.S. soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen died in the war. Another 103,284 were wounded, and 8,177 are missing in action. Most likely, they're dead, but you can't confirm it until you actually find a body. So they're listed as missing in action. But it's if you add them onto the U.S. dead and possibly how many of the wounded soldiers died, you can see the true amount of those who died in the war. South Koreans suffered even more, 138,000 South Koreans. Most of them were in the initial stages before the UN forces were there. The other UN forces, these were Britain, Canada, Luxembourg, 3,600 dead. And they estimate between North and South Korean civilians, 2.5 million. Now, up to 350,000 North Koreans died in the war, and an incredible 400,000 Chinese died. These are the soldiers. These are the results of their highly questionable military tactics of charging enemy positions and just being killed by them. And ultimately, 400,000 did die in the war. Now, in 1995, the Korean War Veterans Memorial was dedicated by President Clinton. It's in Washington, D.C. You can see the Lincoln Memorial in the background. This is in the mall. It's right across from the Vietnam Memorial. I took this picture like 2 summers ago. What I really like about this is that if you ever go there in the winter and there's like they have snow, maybe a couple inches, now it looks like the soldiers are walking through the snow, and there was a lot of snow in North Korea. Their winters got it can be very brutal up there. So interesting enough if you ever go there in the wintertime. Now these men here, you see they're all wearing light blue jackets. These are American veterans of the Korean War. The jackets are blue, light blue, because that's the color of the flag, the UN flag that they fought under. So if you see a Veterans Parade or Memorial Day Parade, and you see these men marching with their light blue jackets, you know now these are the Korean War veterans. All right? My father-in-law had a jacket, right?
Yeah.
Yes, he did. He was one of the veterans of the Forgotten War. You might know someone, maybe a grandfather or an uncle or a neighbor who was one of these veterans. So if you see them in a parade or you see them with the jackets, you know they're a Korean veteran, thank them. Say thank you very much. They're up there in ages now. I think probably the youngest, they're definitely in their 80s, if you think about it, because the war was fought back in the 1950s. So these are not young men, and unfortunately, they're dying at a higher rate because they are older. But if you do see one, say thank you. Now, the result of the war, we didn't win it. We didn't lose, but we didn't win it. And some Americans became very angry at the cost of the war, not the financial cost, but the amount of soldiers. Technically it's over 40,000, almost 45,000 soldiers died in the Korean War. And we have very little to show for it. The country's still divided. North Korea is still communist, and we had nothing to show for it. And a lot of people were very upset because they felt that maybe the government wasn't serious about stopping communism. We just defeated Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan. We couldn't defeat North Korea, even with the help of the Chinese. So a lot of Americans started to wonder, are we really, the American government, Was it serious about communism? They questioned the military, the army. Remember, we talked in the last section that Senator McCarthy had criticisms of the army, and that's what brought about the whole trial with the army that actually brought about his downfall. But a lot of people question the military, and we see the Korean War is just one more reason why the Cold War at home and McCarthyism gained so much traction among so many Americans who felt there were people in our government who were what they call soft on communist. You know, they weren't communist Reds, but they were like, you know, slightly red. In other words, pink, thus the term pinkos. So anyway, all right, so that ends our thing on the Korean War. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. It's an important piece of American history that we don't know a lot about, truly the forgotten war. All right, so enjoy your day, and if I don't talk to you later, have a good weekend. Bye-bye.